So by using the two voices together, along with some clever sort of those volume envelopes we were talking about, you can achieve different types of instrument sounds, like in this next example, something like a piano or a harp.
Yep. This is just the first two voices of the NES pulse width oscillators.
And this is a really great example of the ingenuity Uematsu used in working with this fairly limited system. The Prelude from Final Fantasy I, we're all familiar with this tune. If you've ever played a Final Fantasy game, like a mainline Final Fantasy game, you've heard this a million times, right? Every time you boot it up, you're like, oh, here we go. You know, I don't know about you guys, but when I turned on Final Fantasy 15, I was like, where's Prelude? And there's like a really funny way, funny story of how this like piece came to be. Uematsu was, in his office, and Final Fantasy I was going out the door, and the director of the game, Hironobu Sakaguchi, apologize for any bad Japanese pronunciation, he comes into the office like the game is shipping, right? The game is done, and he's just like, hey, Uematsu, we need one more piece of music, and we need it like right now. Like, not tomorrow, not tonight, right now. And so Uematsu wrote the Prelude in about half an hour. And he often says, like, it's a little embarrassing that it's become so, like, prevalent in all the games, and it's become so popular, because he's like, yeah, this isn't something I worked on. Like, I didn't craft this, like, I crapped this, So
that's what it takes.
Exactly. And what's really, really impressive about that is the fact that, it's just using those two pulse wave oscillators. It's not a complex piece. And now it's being played in the title of every single Final Fantasy game.
So it's only the first two channels, rising and falling in arpeggiations. And the second channel's a little softer and a little varied from the other. And even though it's like really simple, it actually implies a lot. Like you can really easily hear it as a right and left hand. And it kind of sounds like a warm-up exercise or like a practice etude.
Thinking like harp or like a mallet instrument kind of warm-up exercise.
That's what I would have known. And you're about to play the game, so it's sort of an aural warm-up, which is pretty awesome.
So do we want to hear just that first voice one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to break this down. So this is first voice of that Prelude.
So yeah, it's clear, it's loud, it's on the beat. And the second voice is like a little quieter than that.
Yeah, so this is the second voice.
It doesn't really sound much quieter, but it is.
Trust us.
And it's a little bit of that different...
off the beat.
Yeah, and that little bit of that different pulse width oscillation as well.
It gives you that echo effect in a really pretty smart way without really being able to do it. And it's not a new technique, but it's a standalone piece that has it's probably like the best illustration of just using those two channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like other composers for the NES were using this sort of like displacing of the same pitch off the beat in order to create an echo by using different volumes. And the Prelude is such a good illustration of this effect. So like here's the Prelude. We're going to have voice one, and then we're going to feed in voice two.
Yep. So hopefully you hear.
It feels really good, right? Sorry, I really love it. So the first time I heard this effect and understood it, I kind of had this like really wonderful feeling of like I get it, right? Like I get this music. It's really neat. It's just like this is a little bit deeper than I thought it was. Like it's not just like, oh, that's the intro. It's like, oh, this is really cool. Like this is interesting. But sorry, I digress.
Yeah. It's all good. And let me play a little bit of the Final Fantasy III title music because it's the same but different. It's kind of interesting to hear where he takes it.
A little slower.
Yeah, and rounder. I think he's using like the straight up square wave oscillator there.
It sounds a little more like pedal sustained rather than like two hands going together. It sounds more like just one line.
Yeah, and we're going to talk.
Piano pedal.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about this later. But I think one of the great things about chiptune music in general, and certainly this Final Fantasy stuff specifically, is how much of our opinions about the music is not informed by what's happening in the music, it's informed by the music reminding us of something that we're familiar with. Because the music is so limited, it just is, right?
Yeah.
And so what a lot of clever composers are going to do is not so much go, oh, what notes am I going to play, but like, what feeling am I going to remind you of so that your brain is filling in the gaps, in filling in the notes that I can't play with four voices. But we'll talk more about that later. So yeah, that's the Prelude, and but maybe we want to talk about something a little more heavy duty.
A little more 4-track.
All right, so here we go. Let's listen to some battle music from Final Fantasy II. Awesome. So we're hearing a new voice in here. I'll go over this real quick. Basically, so we talked about those two square wave oscillators, and you could do like pulse width modulation, you could do envelopes, and they each have their own individual volume control that the developer can control, and all of that is great. And the third voice that the NES has, which is a triangle wave oscillator, has none of that. It is on or off, it is one volume, no envelopes, no pulse width modulation, and it sounds like this. You guys will recognize that as the bass line from every Nintendo title.
Scott Pilgrim plays at the beginning of the bass battle.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting to point out that this is the exact same bass in literally every Nintendo game, except for a few like outliers. But like when you hear a bass voice in a Nintendo game, it is the same exact instrument. You cannot control the volume. You cannot control the the wave form. It's like bass or not bass.
Yeah, you can kind of control the volume because its volume is paired with the noise oscillator and the digital sampler, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it is very interesting that it got pretty much only used for bass, and used for bass here because it's useful for that. Cool. So next up, the fourth and final synthesizer voice of the NES that it could make was the noise channel, which gave you 32 different notes that were actually sort of like pitch filtered notes of noise. And it sounded like this. That's it. That's what it does. So you got 32 different flavors of that.
Yeah, it's basically the Nintendo's like sound chip beatboxing.
Yeah. So, and that's used for snare drums and explosions and kind of scratchy sounds, attack sounds in Final Fantasy games in particular on the NES.
Mm-hmm. And for many games, like the noise channel is often used as a sound effect channel for for firing a weapon, for slashing a sword.
Mm-hmm.
There's like 5 people who are like, yeah, it is. We all and if you notice, we just played the battle music from Final Fantasy 3. And this is the first battle music that has a noise channel. And what you saw, especially in a lot of early Nintendo titles, is the noise channel would often be missing in music that was in a battle-type situation, often to leave it open for sound designers, or oftentimes a composer doing sound design, to use that as sound effect, right? Like Manami Matsume, the composer for Mega Man 1, right? Her first game on the Nintendo was a Mahjong game. And if you listen to her music, it has no noise channel. There's no like sort of drum. And that's because if you watch the gameplay, every time they deal out the cards, it's just like, and it would be really lame if you had this like,
yeah,
right. So you see that a lot, especially in early titles.
Yes, and also if you pay attention to the music in Super Mario, for instance, every time you jump, you lose the lead line. You lose and I don't know why they made this choice, because it would make much more sense to lose the goofy harmony line that's underneath it. So if you jump a lot, and it's hard to hear because you jump super loud, but if you jump a lot and listen to what's going on musically behind that, it's bonkers, because you just hear this weirdo harmony line along with the bass line, and it's great. It's like getting you off into Calypso Stravinsky land, and I love it.
Speaking of getting off into different lands, I think we have one more awesome voice to talk about.
Yeah, so real quick. So, I cannot speak from authority on how the NES digital sampler worked. I only know that it was real goofy and it sounded like this. here it's being used for like a kick drum.
Like opening Pringles in a commercial.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's pretty clever. I'll play that one more time because it is pretty neat what they did. Like here, you're like, yeah, that's got like a kick drum. I'll buy it. But it's actually just like a really short sample that's being played back of like a kind of a kick sound, sort of.
Yeah, and my personal theory about why they used the sampler, which was not often used because it took a ton of memory to like have a digital sample, is because they wanted to open up more room for the battle sounds. So you could actually have the sword slashing and it wouldn't make the drum just like completely disappear. So they used Uematsu used the sample channel to sort of subvert and like support the noise channel and free it up so that if you do slash something or if the noise channel does need to be accessed, it doesn't just make the bottom drop out of the music, which would be super lame.
Mm-hmm.
Is it called the sample channel because it is a sample on part?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. So let me clarify. The only if you were an NES developer and you wanted your audio to get into the ears of players, the only way to do it was in these goofy super bitrate reduction digital samples. They were basically little 7-bit samples. They were played back in 8-bit architecture, but they're like little 7-bit digital samples with like a really, really intense bitrate reduction. And additionally, the CPU had to do some extra stuff in order to make that work. So oftentimes it would interrupt animation updates on screen, and so then audio and art would have to have another fight. That was the only way for you as a developer to get your audio to the ears of players. Otherwise, all your game was doing was sending instructions to the Nintendo APU, and then it was actually synthesizing in real time based on those instructions.
Yeah, it didn't like store the music.
So that's how you got Ghostbusters.
Yeah, the Ghostbusters, Skater Die, all of that. Yeah, and they would put it in the.
Did someone just do double dribble?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Did the APU have the ability to like interleave in real time? Like if you had a drum beat, could you insert like a slash sound in the middle of a rhythm without it breaking?
Absolutely. So because the MIDI machine language, the music machine language was very low level. I don't know what like the rhythmic resolution of the console was, but I mean the APU was running at a pretty high clock rate of like something or other megahertz, so I assumed that it was
something or other megahertz.
I don't.
We all got that right.
You guys, I'm not an electrical engineer, and I'm not going to BS you guys with like a YouTube
really
blogger
big
version of
car
an
rental
explanation.
company.
Yeah, I am at the absolute limit of my knowledge about how this crap works. But yeah, you could put a sound wherever you wanted. It wasn't locked to like a grid. It definitely wasn't MIDI. MIDI is a little higher level, and in MIDI there's a thing called a note. And with the music machine language, there wasn't that. There were strings of give me this pitch, please, at this time. So they could pretty much do whatever they wanted within the limitations, which is kind of cool.
And it's really interesting to note. I'm gonna steal this little nugget of info from you. But so you have this like digital sampler, right? And it could do these like really bit crushed, horrible sounding samples. Like and it's really great. You guys familiar with Sunsoft? Like they made a bunch of games. So they and Ron Hubbard were very famous for using the sample channel in what's called a Hocket. If you're not familiar with that term, it's like, let's say I have the numbers 1 through 8, right? But I'm going to take all the odd numbers and put those into the noise channel. And then I'm going to take all the even numbers and I'm going to put those in the sample channel, right? And so what you get is you get a full line of 1 through 8, except like they're not coming from the same place. And so they would do these really weird, like super tricky things where the sample channel would play like a bass note here and then the triangle wave would dump out and play something totally weird. But it all comes out as one line and it's super bonkers and really fun. It's really cool to listen to Sunsoft game soundtracks and just be like, oh, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
You didn't have flat for this, right?
Yes.
And when you listen to the music on Sunsoft games, I mean, I feel like it's not always the best like composition necessarily, but you listen to it and you're like, well, this sounds better than most NES titles, like right off the bat.
Yeah, it had a fidelity that most titles didn't have.
Yeah, somebody there broke it better in a really good way, which is
and it's not just Sunsoft. Lots of people did it, but Sunsoft was really famous for it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same thing that's going on in games like Ultra Games, like 2A03 type stuff? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
I'm not an authority on that, but why don't you talk to me after and we can do some research because that sounds super weird, and I love it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's why we're all here. Cool. So we've talked about the NES for a very long time.
Yeah, he was super clever and used some really great tricks, and now let's move on to the SNES.
Hear this? Okay, let's listen to some music
We have
from
a lot of stuff
Final
to talk
Fantasy.
about.
Yeah.